Welcome and welcome back to the Icon Dynamic Objects Group Symposium 2025. We are about to start session 2, and which we're all very much looking forward to. I'm standing in for Françoise, who is the chair of the Dynamic Objects Group. So in session 2, we have 2 talks, as you can see from your programme. We'll start with a talk from Jonathan Betts, and then follow that with a talk by Christopher King. So I'll briefly introduce Jonathan, who probably needs no introduction, but nonetheless, I will do it, and then I'll hand over to him. Jonathan will be talking about the Waddesdon Elephant automaton, forever for everyone. So Jonathan, as I'm sure you all know, is an ex-conservator and curator at the Royal Museums, Greenwich, now horological historian, and consultant to various heritage bodies, including since 1980, Horological advisor to the National Trust. Jonathan has served as Icon trustee for 3 years and is currently a vice president and honorary librarian for the AHS. In 2013, Jonathan received the Anna Plowden Medal for his contribution to horology conservation. So we're all very much looking forward to hearing from Jonathan. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to give a talk on the Waddesdon Elephant, which I'm calling Waddesdon's Automaton Elephant Forever for Everyone, which, as you may or may not know, is the National Trust's, or was the National Trust's strapline for their intent in preserving our heritage for the future. And this is the Waddesdon Elephant. That's what I'm looking at this afternoon. It's a single and very significant example of an historic automaton. And it's a very magnificent piece indeed, signed by Hubert Martinet and preserved at Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, a National Trust property. So following just a brief description of the object and its various automated displays, I'll briefly describe the process of bringing the object back to life over the last 30 years and more. And I'll summarize what we know and what we've learned about the piece itself and its functional history and use. I'll also touch on how one might go about preserving this and other such historic pieces for future generations. First, then, a description of the object itself. From the evidence we have, we can say that this extraordinary automata was made in Clerkenwell in London between the late 1760s and the early 1770s. It's signed in pastes on a gilt metal plaque on the trunk, H. Martinet, and you can see probably there F, which we believe stands for fecit, in the Latin for made me, which is Hubert Martinet implying that this was made by him, or made under his instruction as we understand it. As you can see, it's much more than just an automaton elephant, and the object as a whole stands nearly 1.5 meters high, including the heavily decorated and automated base. Well, now here I would love to include details and the life and work of Hubert Martinet, who's a really fascinating figure in 18th century horology in London and Paris. But sadly, there really isn't time, given that I only have 20 minutes. If I knew I'd had a bit longer, I would have packed in a whole load more. But Roger Smith of Blackheath, that is, not Roger Smith of the Isle of Man. There are 2 very distinguished Roger Smiths, and this is the London Roger Smith, and I have been researching Hubert Martinet for many years. And we hope soon to see a book published on Martinet and specifically the elephant. So you'll have to wait for that to find out all about this extraordinary man, Hubert Martinet. Today, then, we'll just look at the automaton itself and its conservation. Did that go? Yes, I think it did, didn't it? Yeah. So, looking at Mr. Elephant and his automation, when operated, he flaps his ears, wags his tail, rolls his eyes from side to side, and moves his trunk in the most lifelike fashion. As you can see, the elephant's body is in exceptionally well-finished bronze-patinated gilding metal with gilt metal mounts. At the same time as the elephant does his tricks, the paste-set wheels and stars on the animal's left and right flanks contra-rotate, and up in the howdah on his back, sets of jeweled stars behind glass on the front and back similarly contra-rotate. Those are the ones against the light blue backgrounds there, while a series of soldiers appear to march past windows on the left and right-hand sides of the howdah. You can see those in the little window at the top of the howdah there on the elephant. Crowning this ensemble, and master of all he surveys, there is the mogul sitting under the canopy who swings majestically from side to side. A single sequence of this automation lasts about 35 seconds, but if not stopped, he will continue happily for over 20 minutes. This would all take place in silence were it not for the fact that the huge painted and gilt metal mounted base that the elephant stands on contains another entirely independent large musical mechanism inside, which plays 5 tunes with 24 hammers on 12 bells. In addition, this mechanism controls no less than 18 other automated features around the sides and on top of the base. On the left and right-hand sides are 4 scenes of figures walking or marching on terraces or bridges in a variety of stylized scenes. The inset picture here you can see showing just one of the chains of figures that go round the cycle in each of the 4 scenes. At the front of the base, believe it or not, a pair of snakes and a row of pastes twist and wriggle their way round a maze of contra-rotating stars. You can see inset a side view of that movement showing the pulleys which provide the course for the chain. Meanwhile, at the back, a gilt metal griffin sits contemplating a 3-dimensional contra-rotating star feature, and both front and back scenes are flanked on both sides by revolving jeweled cones. You can see there to the left and right of the griffin. The top of the base is mounted with 4 paste-set flowers, which either have contra-rotating circles of petals, as seen here on the left. I can't point, but just the elephant's foot on the left of this picture, you can see just below it is the flower with the contra-rotating petals. And on the right of the base, on both the left and the right sides, are lilies which appear to open and close. And if you look at the base of the elephant's back foot to the right of this picture, you'll see that there is a lily there with petals that come forward and retract, opening and appearing to open and close. Where are we now? Yes, and on the top of the base, at each corner, you can see there are musicians, and they swing to and fro as the music plays. The base mechanism runs about the same time as the elephant, and if it's left switched on, it will run for about a quarter of an hour. The whole ensemble was originally mounted on a turntable, the underside of the base still retaining its central steel pivot, you can see here, and the rollers, but unfortunately the lower part of the base has long since disappeared. So all in all, quite a show. But it's one which by the 1990s had not run for many years. So in the early 90s, I was approached by the curatorial staff at Waddesdon, who were considering the feasibility of getting the whole object working again and playing its music after many decades of static display. Now, the Rothschild family still have an important and beneficial presence at Waddesdon, and while the house and contents are officially looked after by the National Trust, both the Rothschild family and the Trust had a say in the aims of this project. Both agreed that the principal requirement for such a conservation project was to ensure as little material change as possible in the object as it has come down to us. The National Trust's famous strapline that you've just heard, "Forever for Everyone," the subtitle of this talk, whilst obviously being impossible if taken literally, is the essential aim in as much as it is feasible. However, preliminary inspections of the movements revealed it was all badly worn and very dirty, with old congealed oil throughout the mechanism. Some of my colleagues at the time told me that they were sceptical any kind of conservation would be possible, and that the wholesale restoration and replacement of parts would be necessary to get this thing fully operational again. This I was determined would not happen, and over the last 30 years, a painstaking series of conservative treatments and overhauls have now successfully seen the elephant working again with minimal intervention. The whole automata was dismantled and overhauled in 1994 and photographed at the time. This is the elephant during dismantling. Note, as I say, the exceptionally fine treatment of the patinated bronzed gilt metal body with extremely lifelike chasing to represent the hide. The action of the rotating paste wheels you can see on his side, the marching soldiers on the disc above, the swinging potentate in the howdah and tail, they're all managed with simple connections to the wheelwork within the body or by cranks connected to them. The highly realistic action of the trunk, however, has a rather more sophisticated construction. The trunk itself is made up of a series of tapered, interlocking, gilt metal cylindrical shells, loosely riveted together, with a curved brass rod running up inside. Here is Mr. Elephant opened up to show the whole movement. Note there are drives out to the tail on the left, to the howdah at the top, and side displays of pastes. The curved brass rod within the trunk, however, is caused to revolve, but also to rise up and down, causing the trunk to appear to not only wave about, whilst also expanding and contracting in a most lifelike fashion. I think you can probably see here the long pinion which is attached to the curved brass rod. That pinion is not only racked to and fro by the brass rack below, but it's also drawn up through the rack so that the curved rod not only rotates but moves up and down. Looking at the mechanism more generally, notice the movement within the elephant is of a plain modular design and has separate modular additions to it, enabling the other features to operate. The design is generally pretty good. Much is expected of these mechanisms, and notice how the drives to the various features are laid out so as to spread and share the loading throughout the train of wheels, rather than having one main driving point where everything else comes off. The evidence looking at this mechanism for many craftsmen working on one object such as this is also quite clear. For example, the modular parts, such as the main motor and the small wheel movements, are well finished in themselves, but they bear some evidence of less careful attention to detail in the process of being fitted, suggesting a different hand and perhaps a failure in quality control during the completion that one does sometimes see in English clockmaking where the movement has been fitted to the case. Two very carefully made parts of a mechanism, but then they get the apprentice to put the two together, and you have this strange combination of very beautifully finished things with a slight anomaly where they actually meet, so to speak. And there's quite a lot of evidence of that, which gives one a clue as to the great team of people who were actually involved in making this thing. The uniformity of the modular parts in complex automata such as this contrasts with the construction of the one-off ancillary parts unique to such rarefied creations. Brass parts of standard movements would have patterns made for casting whole pieces for finishing and fitting, whereas odd-shaped parts made in the workshop during assembly specifically just for one task were often fabricated from plate by soldering up, as is evidenced by the solder lines you can see here, for example, on the foot of one of the cocks in the base of the elephant automaton. Moving on to the base, when you take off all the upper mounts, this is what you see. Like the elephant movement, the layout of the many drives to the features on the base are carefully designed to ensure the loadings are spread throughout the train of the main motor. The musical work is played by the usual pinned barrel with 5 different tunes, the bell carriage shunting along to change tunes. The tunes are played on 12 bells, each bell having 2 hammers for rapid repetition. As for what the program is, the only recognizable tune we've identified so far is Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush, but others are also likely to be British folk tunes, and I can only say they seem fairly familiar to me, so research to identify them is ongoing. Here's a look at the construction of the base frame, and a rather wonderful thing it is too, all in oak. Note that all the drives are in metalwork, of course, but are mounted on the oak structure. I don't have to tell the practical ones among you the potential there for mechanical unreliability should the environment change, and the conservation of this whole object was and remains a real challenge. To give an idea of the many hundreds of parts involved, here's just some of the elephant during his recent servicing, when the exterior parts were all lightly cleaned by Paul Tier and his team of metals conservators. Back in 1994, on the first treatment, the movement parts were cleaned in the solution we developed at Greenwich, known familiarly as Thames soup, the active ingredients mainly being a solution of DTPA with mild surfactant to remove all the old oils and accumulated dirt and dust. As for the mechanical work, all the mechanisms were pretty worn, as I've mentioned, and had evidently been much used and required very careful repairs. Quite a lot of very light pivot dressing and bushing was required, but was minimized by using these narrow wall bushes like the one you can see in the top of the picture here. When these bushes were put in, they were always put in directly into the plate without any finishing on either side of the plate to meet conservation standards with minimal intervention. The bushing also had to be very carefully judged in terms of side shake and end shake. As you can imagine, it had to be a compromise to ensure that no bearings tightened up when the 56.4 kilogram elephant was placed on top of the base. You can imagine that with the potential for everything to move slightly and to just slightly tighten up was very great. And it takes a whole day just to get the elephant off and to get the top of the base off. So you really don't want this thing to tighten up once you've put the elephant back on. On the other hand, you don't want to put too much leeway in the bushes because you're halfway to them being worn again. So it was a very, very careful judgment. And there are many, many bushes in this system, so each one had to be very carefully measured, shall we say. Of course, extensive recording by notes, photographs and sketches were carried out throughout this project. There were two very badly broken features. These are the last to be done. They're in process at the moment of being completed, which will be the last of this lengthy process of conservation. Owing to continual use in the past, one of the automated lilies, you can see here on the left, has 4 detached petals. Now, these petals you can just see on the top of the main hub of the lily, the little wires that connect from the back onto the backs of the petals to ensure the petals hinge forward and then hinge back when the flower is opening. They're very fine and they become fractured with use, and they had become so badly fractured that they eventually broke, and all of those little struts will probably need replacing or extending. The contra-rotating petals on one of the other flowers that you saw earlier has also become so badly worn and damaged. And you can see here on the right, there's a little kind of gearbox behind those flowers, and that many of the teeth have broken off and been sheared off. And I'm afraid I've tried to decide what best to do about it. And apart from actually sectioning in the majority of replacement teeth, which was an option, I decided to go for knocking both the main central wheels off the hub, because they're friction fitted onto that hub, and preserving them in store as they are, and cutting 2 new wheels to fit into that little gearbox. So that still needs to be done. Here's the snake feature again, the splendid snakes. This is the feature in the whole of the automata which consumes the greatest amount of energy. You can imagine the friction that is involved in these snakes, which are made up basically the same as the trunk. They are with dozens and dozens of little silver and silver gilt shells, all loosely riveted together so that they can flex sideways and telescope in and out. The potential for friction in those and in the chains below them, which you can't see when it's running around the pulleys, is enormous. So this is by far the most hungry, shall we say, of all of the features in the whole of the automata base. So a great deal of careful polishing of pivots, of pulleys, and freeing up of chain was necessary to make this, to reduce the consumption here. Remember too that if any one of these bearings in the base or in any of the features, if just one pivot tightens up, everything stops. So you really do have to get it all right. And the idea of having, if something does tighten up, having to take the elephant off and get the top off, as you've heard, it's more than a day's work just to get inside. So there's a certain amount of trepidation in getting these things well balanced. In fact, it's an interesting, one of the many interesting things that came out of this research, because all the time not only were we thinking about how to conserve this object best, but we're looking for information because, of course, Waddesdon want to know about its history, they want to know what it is, they want to know how it works. So all of that was in our minds at the same time. And there was a curiosity about the rear automaton with the griffin with its little coned star. Somehow it didn't quite look right. Why is it in that circular sort of goldfish bowl, it just didn't quite ring true. And then it dawned on me, having taken all the gilt mounts off, that actually that hadn't been there originally, and that what was originally intended by Martinet was to have two snake features, one at the back and one at the front. But clearly it consumed way too much energy. Even with just the one at the front, it's verging on trouble. So the one on the back clearly was taken away during manufacture, and you had to think of something else to go in that place. So we have this slightly sort of weak, shall we say, little sort of griffin looking up at this coned star, which consumes very much less energy. So that's another part of its history which we reckoned to add to the story. The movements in the automata were also found to bear a considerable amount of repairer's graffiti, which of course is fascinating, some of which has proved most interesting in identifying the working life of the automaton. As I said earlier, as for the history of this wonderful object, we now know a number of documents which provide evidence of its creation under Martinet's direction in Clerkenwell from the late 1760s, but there just isn't time to go into that today. It's really another whole lecture in itself. What we do know is that in the 19th century, Waddesdon's Elephant was in a European sort of travelling circus, I suppose you could call it, just travelling museum run by Messrs Tate and Frechon. And this is an extract from a catalogue published by George Tate, seen here on the left, in the 1850s, which shows Waddesdon's Elephant in a woodcut. Before acquisition by George Tate, sometime before 1839, its exact provenance is not known. But graffiti in the elephant's movement reveals it to have been on tour in Europe in the first half of the 19th century. We see it is here in Holland in 1829. Then it was in Amsterdam in 1835. And then in Danzig in 1856 and Hamburg in 1864. What we do know is that Baron de Rothschild then acquired the elephant automaton for the Waddesdon collections sometime before 1889, and that from a label inside the upper baseboard, the automaton was worked on again in 1925 by the London restorers Hatfield and Sons. Another fascinating discovery during this work was that the original music program had been changed, and that the Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush and the other probably English folk tunes were not the originals for this automata. The original program had been in brass pins, whereas the current program with the English folk tunes are in steel pins. And we discovered this by looking inside the cylinder and seeing all the tails of not only the steel pins, but the original brass pins as well. What had happened was they had simply, if you like, kind of harvested them off, just mowed them off and put the steel pins in. But you can see that the evidence remains of the old program in the form of brown sort of tarnish spots. And all of those pins are visible now as little brown spots. And this, of course, presents us with a fascinating possibility of being able to determine the original tunes at some stage if we can only scan this thing really carefully and get it into a form where, in theory, and this is where I lose my ability to judge with any intelligence, in theory there should be some kind of computer program which ought to be able to read a photograph and identify each pin and its note. And that's about as technical as it gets from me, from IT, but I'm sure it should be possible. Having said that, afterwards I can tell you what we've tried, and you'd be surprised at what isn't out there. I'd have thought in the 21st century this should have been a doddle. You know, they do 3D scanning of of archaeological skulls, and they can reconstruct a whole head of somebody. And I thought, well, get the cylinder on that, get it turning and get it all scanned. Job done, but we tried, and it's not that simple. It's not 3D in a sense. What we're looking at is a plain surface, and those who came to Waddesdon to do the scanning had misunderstood what it was we needed, and they said, I'm afraid our system just can't do it. So I'd be very interested to hear what people think about the possibility. It has to be possible. Seeing as we've got extra time, I can tell you what I did do, which sounds utterly bizarre, but actually it was the nearest thing to working. It occurred to me that the brown spots are sufficiently visible to be visible on a photocopier. So I thought, first of all, well, if I could just photograph them or maybe photocopy. And then I thought, well, the light bar runs across. And that's where it's reading. So why don't I take the cylinder and simply try and follow the light bar? And you'd think, nah, that can't possibly work. It worked. It worked rather well. And I was able to keep the cylinder rolling, following the light bar, and out came an A3 sheet of paper with not a bad idea of where all the dots are. So that's the nearest thing I have at the moment, is an A3 sheet with the steel pins as bright dots, because they had polished ends, so they came out white, and the brass plugs, if you like, as dark dots. So if there is no other course, then we can do it mechanically from our sheet of photocopied paper, but I'm sure there must be a more accurate way of doing it. Anyway, where are we? So, moving on. Okay, so the difficult bit. It's what of the future of this important piece of technological and applied arts history? Well, needless to say, there's a great enthusiasm everywhere to see this automaton operate as frequently as possible for the interest and entertainment of Waddesdon's visitors. But of course, this has to be set against the very real fact of life that running such a complex mechanical object will inevitably cause deterioration. Even with the most careful, conservative repair and the best lubricants money can buy, wear in use will take place. And as always in conservation, a compromise is needed if we are to even see the original object survive intact for as long as possible. But it's not just the wear that is the potential problem. Damage caused by catastrophic breaks, such as a mainspring or a pivot failure, can do untold damage, as can accidental damage unintentionally caused by those starting, stopping, winding, and of course we who maintain the object, all of which risks increase with extended use. There's another point. It's also the public perception of historical and cultural value in these objects. I maintain it can certainly be argued that excessive working of such an important object inevitably diminishes the perceived importance of such artifacts and the perceived reverence and care applied to them by their custodians. It's recently been argued in conservation circles that to impose limits to witnessing the function of historical objects denies important access to today's audiences who might benefit most. Unfortunately, this simplistic argument simply fails to recognize that there are countless further audiences in the future who will in turn increasingly be denied access to the real object as mechanical parts slowly but surely have to be replaced as wear and breakages occur. Then there are those for whom the whole concept of the Trust's forever for everyone is logically flawed and should simply be discounted. Now, obviously, forever is not a feasible concept. But that doesn't mean that the principle is not correct in its more realistic aims. But sadly, in the past, such negative views have been held at very senior levels in the heritage world. A few years ago, I was present as horological advisor at a conservation meeting at a notable London collection, shall we say, and had advised that where there was more than one clock working in the rooms in the house, They might consider only having one of them working. Sorry, where there was more than one clock in the rooms in the house, they might consider only having one of them working for the time being to provide the lived-in atmosphere which we all like to see. At that point at the meeting, the director became irritated at this suggestion and came out with the extraordinary remark, "For goodness sake, why are we going so far down this conservation route? After all, we could have a nuclear war tomorrow and the whole thing would be a waste of time." Well, it was difficult to know what to say at such a gulf in understanding. I could only comment that if that contingency was really relevant, there would probably be a number of other things we might be thinking about first. Then there was the extraordinary comment made by the chair of trustees many years ago at the National Maritime Museum, when at a trustees meeting, I suggested that we should not be routinely running Harrison's fourth timekeeper, H4. The chairman, who was, shall we say, very senior indeed, again became irritated at this conservation proposal, saying, "But H4's a small timekeeper, isn't it? How can it matter when the parts are so tiny and the wear is so small?" On that occasion, I thought better not to say anything at all. As for Waddesdon's automaton, the recommendation has in recent years always been to operate the elephant once a month maximum, but perhaps with an occasional operation on other days, but never more for the time being than once a fortnight. Anything more frequent would, I suggest, be putting such an important and historic automaton at risk of unacceptable deterioration in the longer term. But happy to discuss that later if you wish, and I shall finish there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Absolutely fascinating. I love the example of the justification of the nuclear war. In linguistics, that's called an extreme case formulation, a rhetorical device which you deploy to justify some kind of unpopular choice. So, thank you. There are post-it notes at the back of the room because the Q&A session is going to be at the end of the day after session 3. So as we go along, if you have questions for Jonathan or any of the other speakers, please do make a note of those. Really interesting to hear the movement of the trunk described as lifelike, and to connect back to earlier questions of authenticity in Manon's presentation, if you were here this morning, when questions of authenticity and who gets to say what is life and what is life-like, and how those different views or understandings of life and life-like might influence our decisions as conservators. So lots of connections going on, which is really great to see. Thank you so much, Jonathan. So we move now to the second talk in session 2, and we're looking forward to hearing from Christopher King. Christopher is going to be talking about control systems in contemporary artwork. Chris King works as an assistant time-based media conservator at Tate, where he often focuses on the conservation of complex control system-based artworks. Chris has contributed to Tate's software-based art preservation project and to the technical analysis of Tate's net art commissions, published as part of the Reshaping the Collectible When Artworks Live in the Museum. Chris has also presented a number of papers and delivered workshops at the AIC annual meeting and at NACCA. So we look forward to hearing from Chris. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to try and keep this punchy, and I've probably tried to include way too much. But I thought I would try and relate historic automata production to artworks with control systems and how the two traditions connect, and also how time-based media conservation can kind of act as a model for other types of object conservation. So, and then I'm going to show briefly 3 case studies of control systems and how we did and didn't deal with them successfully. So I'd like to try and show how time-based media conservation can offer back models to other contexts for the conservation of dynamic objects. These kinds of models often emerge from critical practice, which takes place in our department at Tate by necessity because of the unstable and ever-changing nature of tasks we need to perform in response to artists' ever-changing tactics. Maybe I'll show that time-based media, interactive and control system-based artworks and contemporary art objects in general bring issues present in the conservation of all objects, especially dynamic ones, to the fore at a comparatively higher frequency due to the rhythm of refabrication and redisplay contemporary art requires, and sometimes more acutely due to the nature of artistic production, obsolescence, and the fragility of the networks of materialization that artworks rely on. Time-based media art conservation is a bit like those fruit flies biologists use as a model organism in disease studies because their life cycle is short and they share 75% of the genes that cause diseases in humans. It's difficult to articulate, and I'm sure everyone finds this, all the sort of interdisciplinary and tacit knowledge that guides decision-making in conservation. Some of you may be familiar with some of the things I'm going to say and show, but I thought it was important to help contextualize the case studies and what I'm going to talk about quickly afterwards. The tactics and nature of the labour artists deploy in making art has been in constant flux almost since the modern concept of the artist has been around. In general, the kinds of works I'm going to discuss cannot be produced by a single artist working alone, but groups of people in the employment of the artist or institution, all contributing their specialist labour in order to materialise something. This, as far as I understand it, as a non-expert or historian of automata, is not dissimilar to the small networks of specialist artisans required to enable the production of complex automata, clocks and other complex mechanical objects. However, it's not just the reliance on a network of workers that links control system-based artworks and automata. The traditions they come out of are directly linked to the traditions of automata production. So like what artists are doing when they make interactive and control system-based works sits in a similar tradition to some of the types of automata that have been historically produced. In addition, the kinds of philosophical inquiry that automata production enables are also the same conceptual tools that can be used maybe back on the analysis of control systems and automata and the work that goes into producing them and dynamic objects in general. So Manon earlier talked about Senster. These 3 essays, 2 of which are by curators, these 3 publications. One is Studio International, and there was a series of articles, but Gustav Metzger, who was the first editor of the Computer Art Society's journal page, talks about automata in history, and the essay is partly in response to the success of cybernetic serendipity, but also its sort of marketing as a kind of fun fair. But cybernetic serendipity was this like critical year zero exhibition at the ICA in 1968. And lots of works, both mechanical, electronic and digital works were shown, all connected by cybernetics, and all of the other 2 works also heavily reference cybernetics, which was developed post-war, and actually came out of fire control, so naval fire control, analog computers, and information processing, but it's the theory of feedback and control, and it was applied to incredibly wide interdisciplinary areas of inquiry, so anthropology, as well as things like systems theories come out of it, information theory, so Metzger talks a lot about the history of automata and the slight disconnect with the history of contemporary kinetic art production, but also about how those 2 histories connect. So the automata from the Islamic world, medieval and Renaissance Europe, India, and so there's this awareness in the first kinds of computer art. And he presented a proposal at Cybernetic Serendipity that was unrealized, but there's a sort of through line. In Yasha Reihart, who was the curator of Cybernetic Serendipity, this is a book that came out, it's not the exhibition catalogue, but it came out afterwards. This includes a lovely essay by Gordon Pask, who was a cybernetician and an educational psychologist who built machines to learn about education. He also, in the 50s, built Musicolor and then Colloquy of Mobiles, which were shown in Cybernetic Serendipity, which are cybernetic artworks that interact with the viewers and different elements of the artwork interact with each other in Colloquy of Mobiles. This also contains another essay, which I really like, which contains pictures, which are 18th century engravings of the master and mistress of horology. So there's this awareness of the connection between mechanical devices and the emergence of computing and the earliest computer art. And then in Beyond Modern Sculpture, Jack Burnham, who curated an exhibition called Software at the Jewish Museum in the 1960s, he talks about system-based art, and basically, it pains me to say this because he's a curator. He predicts all of the problems that face conservators of contemporary control system-based artworks. So he says that, there's going to be the emergence of distributed artistic production, which had kind of already started by the time he was writing this. He also suggests that there will be system-based artworks and acknowledges there already have been that only exist as blueprints or scores, which is something I'll talk a little bit more about, and then are remade each time they're shown, and the need for stockpiling spare parts, and the prediction museums will need electronics technicians. And he also mentions physical authenticity of reproduction, and most radically references the kind of beginnings of like the application of cybernetics to biology, of how organisms maintain their form over time, which I think you maybe can see how that relates to maintaining the form of objects over time. The second set of slides represents much older currents relating to the production of automata and control systems, which I relate to the emergence of systems in contemporary art through the earlier slide I just showed from the 50s to the 70s, kind of the application of cybernetics to contemporary art. So I think these are interesting because they suggest methodologies that we can also apply back to understanding what we're doing as conservators. So De Sfera Mundi, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, basically became a university set text on astronomy, but it contains the analogy of the world as a machine centuries before the Enlightenment clockwork universe and the emergence of mechanical philosophy. Simon Schaefer in Enlightened Automata, which is a really nice book chapter, talks a lot about automata as key to the Enlightenment project and thinking through them enabling philosophical insights into things like the nature of labor and economics, but also the disciplining of people and their labor and the division of labor and how the two relate. And then obviously I went to art school, so I've got Capital up there. Marx did his... Karl Marx spent a lot of time analysing labour and automation. His work is partly a response to Adam Smith and classical economics and the labour theory of value and markets. Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow University, and he developed his theories while in direct contact with James Watt and Joseph Black, professor of anatomy and chemistry, while Watt was developing his advanced steam engine and Black was developing theories of latent heat, the beginning of thermodynamics. Watt developed the quantification of labour as horsepower in order to sell his steam engines to mine owners, measured against the cost of manual techniques. And Marx did his doctoral thesis on Epicurus, who was an ancient Greek philosopher, who amended Greek atomism, so the idea that the universe is composed of discrete static individual elements, which I think you can see is connected to the idea of static objects. So Epicurus suggested to amend this with the swerve, which is basically the replacement of static objects as the primary unit of existence with a matter that's constantly in motion or in flux. Hero of Alexandria, possibly the most famous automata maker in history, or at least one of the earliest that we kind of constantly talk about, in his manual on catapults, he has a little jab at Epicurus' philosophy. What Marx was doing was using methods taken from physics to analyse the dynamic processes and the feedback systems of capital and show its inability to maintain its form or a steady state over time. So it's to do with feedback, like cybernetics. Is the labour content of commodities analogous to significant properties in the performance or a system-based work, but one that's identified through the object's dynamic activation and redisplay. And I guess so James Watt, one of his primary jobs that led him to work on the steam engine was he was given a scaled-down model of a steam engine, which was Glasgow's, because he was a scientific instrument maker, to repair that didn't work, that they'd ordered from a maker in London. And he worked out the theories that govern steam cooling and rebuilt the steam engine. So I think you should be really careful when identifying the significant properties in an object and then rebuilding it so it conforms to those significant properties, because you might do an accidental industrial revolution. This is a sample, and I'm not going to go in depth in all of this, but from our position in time-based media conservation, some of the kind of key and most recent texts. So Pip Lawrenson, who founded our department, has a lot of work on authenticity and abstracting artworks as scores, even ones that don't have scores, so that you can manage their materialization over time. But also, she's written lots of stuff more recent than this. This is just a key text that we use a lot, and acknowledges the limitations of that approach. This manual came out recently, and I'm going to show one image from it, which is the Conservation Time-Based Media Art, which is written by a lot of people working in time-based media conservation, but has a lot of stuff about the maintenance and significance of replaceable parts, and all sorts of different work on time-based media conservation theory, and gives you a good idea of the discourse, especially the essay by René van der Waal I've put up there, but also conservation of contemporary art next to it. Brian Castriota's written a lot about authenticity, and some of what I think Brian writes about from a new materialist lens, which is a kind of reaction to materialism, which is maybe what I've just been talking about, I think comes up with exactly the same themes as what I'm talking about. And then one of my colleagues, Jack, wrote this really nice essay, Nothing Comes of That Is World, which is quite an open-ended account of what it's like to work with an artist who kind of resists the institution and work alongside them in a research project to maintain this kind of open-ended discourse, and maybe through the discourse perform conservation and care, which I think is a really nice challenge to my much more mechanical philosophy hardline approach. So now on to the case studies after that slight bombardment with facts. So I'm going to talk a bit less formally now. This is an artwork by Margaret Hameau, and it's an abstracted sculpture of an elephant's head, which I thought was a nice reference to Jonathan and what he was talking about. And it cries, liquid made from a small percentage of real elephants' tears. I do not know how they extracted them, and I don't want to know. But I'm not going to talk about the full conservation of this work. I'm just talking about control systems. So lots of different people, there's sculpture conservation at Tate working on this as well. I'm not even talking about everything I did. I'm just talking about the elements of the control system, because I don't just work on control systems. And I work with lots of other colleagues who do amazing work too. So these are the pumps, which are like fish tank pumps that work on this. And the controller for this work is very simple. And this starts really basic. It's a microcontroller and Arduino that the artist has made. The power supply is in the box. It's a plastic enclosure. And I knew the manufacturer of the enclosures because I used them myself. I bought the exact same one, the same microcontroller, migrated the software, and I removed the mains power supply, which steps down to 5 volts internally, so that 5 volts can just be run from an external power supply for safety because there's water involved. And I had no qualms about doing this as a conservator. I was comfortable in justifying this as a change, and in time-based media conservation, I think by necessity we're much more comfortable with making bigger changes. And I mean, this is a tiny example of one, but that's why I wanted to show it. And I made copies of this system, and we also back up the software, and we put in place the information we need to migrate software in the future and access it, because the context in which you access software also move. Arduino has a compiler. It's very simple. Also, the program that's running is incredibly simple. You could do it with a timer IC or transistors. It's a regular repeated program, so a plain text description of that is another technique we use. This is a much more complicated at the other end of the scale of things. This is an artwork called Coloured Sculpture by Jordan Wolfson. It has an array of tracking sensors that go around the arena in which it's performed, and it uses theatre automation motors to drag the puppet round the floor and slam it against the floor so it destroys itself and rubs off all of the paint. It's very disturbing. It has video screens for eyes, and the crowd tracking using Xbox Connect means it focuses on people and watches you while it's being tortured. So it's an incredibly creepy, disturbing work. It's also incredibly complicated. And one of the things I worked on this with my much more senior colleagues, Patricia and Melanie, so Patricia in time-based media conservation, Melanie in sculpture conservation. One of the things I did was map this diagram could go much further, and this diagram doesn't involve any feedback, but this is all of the different companies involved and individuals involved in materializing it in the space that it was displayed in, because it was being acquired and shown at the same time in parallel. It uses a program called Touch Designer and some theatre automation software. And the other diagram I wanted to show, so these are the screens. So this is a fiber optic cable that's been rounded and glued to a LCD panel. And that's how the eyes are fabricated by a production company or multiple companies in LA, so who do special effects for film and TV. And there's a project management company involved, and then we had a maintenance team who were a specially hired in maintenance team who did theatre, do a lot of maintenance for animatronics in musicals and things like that. And this is a shot of inside of the head, so you can see that this thing is slammed onto the floor as hard as possible. There are huge amounts of spare sets of eyes, and the companies that produce this stuff don't necessarily exist for as long as the kinds of companies or makers with smaller studios that work on mechanical objects. They're very transient. So even being able to get the same kind of screen OEM from China at the same dimensions that fits into the metal case, there are all sorts of practical considerations about how we would remake this in the future once we've used up all the eyes, because the eyes get used up as it's shown. And then this diagram kind of shows, you don't have to read all of this. This is a mapping of the control system and how each element communicates with each other. So these two diagrams only show tiny elements of the work and everything that's involved in rematerializing it. And it's just too big a work for us to be able to rematerialize or remake it or conserve it in the future without basically completely restarting the project from scratch, using all the pieces that are left and the video documentation we took and all of the software, hard drives we imaged and the software we can access as a model to give to new fabricators to make it again, I think is the conclusion that we kind of came to about this. And so just to finish, am I doing okay for time? Newton was obviously an instrument maker as well as a philosopher. I haven't really gone into this, but I don't know if you noticed the little snaky Ouroboros at the beginning. There's a slight alchemical bent to this, and Leibniz and Newton were both really into alchemy, and alchemy was influenced by geomancy, which basically you generate patterns through feedback. It's a very old tradition that originates in Africa and China, and the I Ching. But he translated a bunch of alchemical texts, and the diagram is from the time-based media conservation book I showed earlier, which is about the redisplay, and you can kind of see the feedback. So the more we redisplay the work, the more we learn. So I guess I'm saying that works produce their kind of own objective significant properties through their interaction with us and how we work with them and the other systems that they work with, which is kind of what a lot of the contemporary theory from a different angle says. Anyway, I'm just coming at it from a more archaic tradition. But yeah, and then to finish, so this is Newton and Spinoza with their snakies in the background. And I guess you can tell everyone about your heretical beliefs, and then you end up in a rented burial ground outside the city like Spinoza, or you can keep them secret to your death, and you end up in Westminster Abbey like Newton. But those are the choices as conservators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that absolutely fascinating talk. What a difficult choice you posed at the end, although I suspect this audience will go for Spinoza over Newton, I don't know. But given that we're here to discuss openly the thinking behind our choices and our beliefs, as conservators, then perhaps we're most likely to be in unmarked graves. Thank you. That was really, really fascinating, and lots of connections back to previous talks, but also to the aim of this symposium, that transition comment that you made between your review of the sort of theoretical literature before you moved on to the case studies, about the need for open-ended discourse as a way of performing conservation and care. I think is really relevant to the purpose of us all being together today. Really great. Thank you so much. All right. So as I said before Chris gave his talk, there will be a Q&A, a panel discussion after session 3. So if you have any comments or questions for Chris, please do make a note of those. There are post-it notes at the back. All right, so now we are going to break, and we'll be back on at 14:35 for session 3, in which we have 2 more talks before our panel discussion. So I hope you enjoy your break. See you back here at 14:35. Thank you very much.